A woman clings to a tree in raging floodwaters, screaming for help. A man rows through hell to save her. Then she robs him and vanishes into the night. 3 weeks later, there's a knock on the door when she returns with more than he expected. Tom Brennan had been rowing through hell for the better part of an hour, and his arms felt like they were about to give out. The spring floods came early that year, turning Willow Creek from a gentle stream into a monster that swallowed everything. Tom's barn was gone. Half his fence line had disappeared overnight. 3 generations of hard work washed away like it was nothing. But he still had his aluminum fishing boat, and right now, that was everything. The current wanted to flip him over, drag him under. Tom had been fighting this creek his whole life, though. 53 years old, weathered hands, shoulders that carried more than their share. 2 years since Martha died. 2 years of eating dinner alone, talking to her empty chair. That's when he heard the scream cutting through the roar of water. Tom squinted through the rain. There, maybe 50 yards downstream, a young woman clung to an oak tree branch. The tree was half submerged, bending under the current's force. She was losing her grip. She couldn't have been more than 25, dark hair plastered to her head, face pale with terror. Every few seconds, the current surged and nearly tore her away, maybe 30 seconds from being swept downstream forever. Tom didn't think, just pulled harder on the oars. The current was vicious. It grabbed at his boat, tried to flip it sideways. But Tom knew this water. 40 years of good times and bad. He knew how to read it, how to use it instead of fighting it. The woman saw him coming. Hope and desperation filled her eyes. "I can't hold on!" she screamed. Tom brought the boat alongside just as the branch started to crack. The sound was sharp, final. "Let go! I got you!" She looked at him like he was crazy. The water below was dark, fast, full of debris. "Trust me!" The branch snapped. She fell, and Tom lunged forward. His boat rocked dangerously as he grabbed her arm and hauled her over the side. She landed hard, gasping, shaking, water streaming everywhere. "You're okay," Tom said, his own heart hammering. "You're okay now." 20 minutes of hard rowing to get back to shore. The woman, Emma, she told him, sat in the bottom staring at the water like it might grab her. Again. "Thank you," she whispered as Tom beached the boat. "I thought I was going to die." Tom helped her out, noticing how she moved, careful, like someone who'd been hurt before. "What were you doing out there?" Emma looked away, running. That was all she'd say. But as Tom led her toward his farmhouse, neither of them knew this simple kindness would test everything Tom thought he understood about trust. At the house, Tom gave her dry clothes, one of Martha's old sweaters, jeans that were too big, but warm. He made coffee, strong and black. Emma sat at his kitchen table, slowly coming back to life. She was beautiful. Not magazine pretty, but real beautiful. The kind that came from strength, dark eyes that held secrets. When she smiled, which wasn't often that first day, it changed her whole face. "I can drive you to town tomorrow," Tom offered. "No," the word exploded out of her, then softer. "Could I stay just for a few days?" "I'll help around the house." Tom looked at this stranger in his kitchen, wearing his dead wife's clothes. The house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. "Sure," he said. For 3 days, it was like having his life back. Emma cooked breakfast every morning. Real breakfast. Eggs, bacon, toast, cut just right. She laughed at Tom's terrible jokes about the weather and his stubborn tractor. She helped assess the flood damage, walking through mud in borrowed boots, taking notes like she actually cared. At night, they sat by the fire and talked. Emma was smart, funny, easy to be around. She asked about Martha, about the farm, about Tom's life in this small corner of the world. She seemed genuinely interested in his stories. Tom found himself looking forward to mornings again, humming while he worked. For the first time since Martha died, the silence didn't feel crushing. Emma never talked much about herself, though. Never mentioned family or where she'd come from. She'd change the subject when Tom asked or find something urgent in another room. She was jumpy, too. Every time a car passed, she'd freeze until it was gone. Never answered when the phone rang. When Tom mentioned driving to town, she always had a reason to stay behind. Tom figured she'd tell him when she was ready. Everyone had secrets. On the third night, they sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the flooded fields orange and gold. Emma seemed relaxed for the first time. "You saved my life," she said quietly. Tom shrugged. Anyone would have done the same. Emma looked at him strangely. No, not everyone would have. As Tom headed to bed that night, he felt something he hadn't in 2 years. Contentment. Tomorrow he'd ask Emma if she wanted to stay longer. Maybe help him rebuild. Maybe they could figure out this thing between them. He had no idea that by morning everything would be gone. Tom woke to silence. Complete, wrong silence. No sounds from the kitchen, no coffee brewing, no Emma humming. He got dressed slowly, cold dread settling in his stomach. He told himself she was probably sleeping in, but deep down he already knew. Downstairs, calling her name. No answer. Her borrowed clothes were folded on the kitchen chair. The spare truck key was gone from its hook. And when Tom checked the coffee tin where he kept his emergency cash, money for flood repairs, his hands started shaking. Empty. Tom stared at the tin, feeling like he'd been punched. The woman he'd saved, the woman he'd been falling for, had robbed him blind and disappeared. $20,300 gone. He sat hard at the kitchen table, head in his hands. How could he have been so stupid, trusting a complete stranger because she smiled at his jokes and cooked his breakfast? The worst part wasn't the money. It was how empty the house felt again. How the silence mocked him for believing he wouldn't spend the rest of his life alone. Tom picked up the phone 3 times to call the sheriff. Each time he set it back down. What would he say? That he'd let a stranger stay and she'd taken his money? That he'd been lonely enough to ignore every red flag because she made good coffee? The shame burned worse than the anger. Days passed, then a week. Tom went through his routine. Livestock damage assessment, figuring out repairs without that money. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and offers to help. "You're looking tired, Tom," Mrs. Henderson said. "Everything all right?" "Just the flood cleanup. Takes it out of you." He couldn't tell her the truth. Couldn't admit he'd been foolish enough to trust a stranger with his home, his money, his heart. The second week was harder. Tom found himself looking for Emma everywhere, half expecting to see her in the kitchen when he came in from chores, listening for her laugh, missing conversations that made the evening hours pass quickly. He'd catch himself setting 2 plates for dinner before remembering he was alone. The truck turned up in Springfield, 60 miles east, abandoned in a Walmart parking lot. Sheriff Miller called to let him know. "No sign of the woman, but the truck's fine. We can have it towed back." "Thanks, Bill. You want to press charges? We could put out a wider alert." Tom looked around his empty kitchen, at Martha's chair, at the coffee tin sitting like an accusation. "Let me think about it." But he already knew he wouldn't. Couldn't explain why exactly. The next evening, Tom sat at his kitchen table with the phone in his hand. Sheriff Miller's number was already dialed. All he had to do was press call. He'd rehearsed it a dozen times. "Bill, I need to report a theft. A woman who stayed here took some money." Simple. Clean. Let the law handle it. His finger hovered over the button, but every time he tried to press it, he heard Emma's voice again, running the way she'd said it, like she was drowning long before she hit that creek water. Tom set the phone down for the fourth time that night. Mrs. Henderson stopped by the next morning with a casserole. She had that look, the one that said she knew something was wrong but was too polite to ask directly. "Haven't seen your truck around much," she said, setting the dish on his counter. "Been using the tractor mostly. Flood damage. You know." Mrs. Henderson wasn't buying it. "Thought I saw it heading toward Springfield last week. You visiting someone?" Tom's mouth went dry. Must have been someone else's truck. Maybe so. But her eyes said she knew he was lying. After she left, Tom realized the whole town would be watching now, wondering, asking questions he couldn't answer without admitting how foolish he'd been. The third week was when the doubts started. Tom caught himself wondering if Emma was okay, if she'd found whatever she'd been looking for, if she was safe, wherever she'd ended up. He tried to stay angry, focus on the betrayal, but late at night, sitting in his empty house, he remembered other things. How she'd flinched when he moved too quickly that first day. The careful way she'd eaten like someone who hadn't had a good meal in a while. The genuine terror when she'd asked to stay. What if she really had been desperate? What if taking his money hadn't been about greed, but survival? Tom shook his head. That kind of thinking was what got him in trouble, making excuses for people being too trusting. Martha used to tease him about it. "You'd give your last dollar to a con man with a sob story," she'd say. "Good thing you got me to keep you honest." But Martha was gone. And Tom had given his last dollars to someone who disappeared like smoke. What Tom didn't know was that 60 miles away, Emma was learning her own lessons about the cost of survival and discovering that some debts can't be repaid with money alone. Thursday morning, end of the third week, Tom was fixing a fence post when he heard a car coming up his driveway. He looked up, expecting Sheriff Miller or a neighbor. Instead, a small blue sedan he didn't recognize was pulling up to his house. The car door opened. A figure stepped out. Emma. Tom stopped dead, his heart suddenly hammering. She looked different, thinner, tired, like she hadn't been sleeping, wearing clothes he'd never seen, hair shorter but definitely her. She saw him and froze, hands still on the car door like she might bolt. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the farmyard. Tom felt a dozen emotions hitting at once. Anger, hurt, confusion, and underneath it all, relief he didn't want to acknowledge. She was alive. She was okay. Emma closed the car door and started walking toward him, moving slowly, carefully. She carried something, a manila envelope, clutched against her chest like a shield. "Tom." Her voice was smaller than he remembered. "Emma." "She didn't expect to see you again." She flinched, looking down at the envelope. "I know I don't have any right to be here. I know you probably hate me." Tom studied her face, looking for signs of deception. She looked genuine enough, but then she had before, too. "Why are you here, Emma?" She held out the envelope with shaking hands. "I came to give this back." Tom took it, feeling the thickness, the weight. He opened it and stared. Cash. A lot of cash. More than she'd taken. His hands trembled as he counted. $2,500, Emma said quietly. "Everything I took, plus interest, plus compensation for the trouble." Tom looked from the money to her face. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "Where did you get this?" "I worked for it." Her voice was stronger now. 3 jobs, 18 hours a day for 3 weeks. Sold everything I owned worth anything. She stopped, swallowing hard. "I couldn't live with what I did to you." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. 3 weeks of 18-hour days, sleeping in her car, all to pay back what she'd stolen. Diner during the day, cleaning offices at night, weekend catering. Slept in my car most nights because I couldn't afford rent and this at the same time. Emma wiped her eyes. "You saved my life, Tom. You gave me food and shelter and kindness when I had nothing, and I repaid you by stealing from you. I became someone I didn't recognize." The anger Tom had carried for 3 weeks started to crack. "Why did you take it in the first place?" Emma's composure broke. She sat hard on his porch steps, burying her face in her hands. "Because I was scared. Because I was running from people who wanted to hurt me, and I needed money to keep running. Because I told myself it was just borrowing, that I'd pay you back somehow." She looked up, tears streaming. "But mostly because I was a coward. You showed me what a good person looked like, and it made me realize how far I'd fallen. So I ran like I always do." Tom sat beside her on the steps, the envelope still in his hands, his anger dissolving, replaced by something he couldn't name. "What were you running from?" "Bad choices. An ex-boyfriend who didn't understand what no meant. Debts I couldn't pay. A life that got so complicated I couldn't see any way out except to disappear." "Marcus," Emma's voice went flat. 2 years together. He had a temper, especially when drinking." She was quiet for a moment, lost in memory. The last night came back in flashes. Marcus's fist connecting with the wall inches from her head, his voice slurred with bourbon. "You think you can just leave me? You think anyone else would want damaged goods like you?" She'd waited until he passed out, then packed one bag and emptied their joint account. It wasn't stealing, she told herself. It was survival. "I tried to leave twice before. He found me both times." Emma touched her cheek unconsciously. "He said he'd changed, that he needed me. But men like Marcus don't change. They just get better at apologizing." The third time, she'd been smarter. Bought the old car with cash, no paper trail, slept in different places every night. But running gets expensive, and the money had run out just as the spring rain started. "I was sleeping by the creek because it was isolated, safe. When the water started rising, I thought I could drive out." Emma's laugh was bitter. "Car got stuck in the mud. By the time I got free, the current had me." Tom looked at this woman who had turned his world upside down, sitting on his porch, crying. Something shifted inside him. The anger was still there, but mixed with something else now. Understanding. "Maybe you could have kept running, kept the money. I never would have found you." Emma nodded, fresh tears spilling. "I tried to. For about 2 days. I tried to convince myself you'd be fine. That you probably had insurance or savings. But I kept thinking about the way you looked at me that last night, like I mattered, like I was worth saving. She turned to face him fully. In her eyes, Tom saw complete, raw honesty. Nobody had looked at me like that in years, Tom. And I threw it away for $2,000. Neither spoke for a moment. The wind through the trees, the distant murmur of the creek that had brought them together. Finally, Tom spoke. "You hungry?" Emma blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "I was about to make lunch. Coffee's probably still hot." Tom stood, brushing dirt off his jeans. "Seems like we should talk." Emma stared at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. "Tom, I don't—" "After what I did, you came back," Tom said simply. "You worked yourself into the ground to make it right. That means something." He walked to his front door, then turned back when she didn't follow. "You coming in, or planning to sit on my porch all day?" Emma stood slowly, like she couldn't believe what was happening. "Are you sure?" Tom thought about the past 3 weeks, the anger, the hurt, the shame, the empty house and silent dinners. But he also thought about the woman who'd sat at his kitchen table laughing at his stories, who'd helped assess flood damage and cooked breakfast and made his house feel like home again, even if only for 3 days. "I'm sure," he said, opening the door. "Come on in." Emma followed him into the kitchen, moving carefully. Tom put on fresh coffee and pulled sandwich fixings from the refrigerator. "So, tell me about these 3 jobs." Emma sat in the same chair as before, hands folded. "The diner was hardest. 12 hours on my feet dealing with customers who thought being rude to the waitress was a sport. But the tips were decent and they let me eat leftovers. And the cleaning, office buildings downtown, midnight to 6 a.m., emptying trash, mopping floors. It was quiet, at least. Gave me time to think." Emma accepted the coffee Tom offered. "Too much time, maybe." "What did you think about?" Emma wrapped her hands around the mug, staring into it. "About how I ended up in that creek. About the choices that led me there. About you pulling me out when you could have just kept rowing." Tom made 2 ham sandwiches, cutting them the way Martha used to. He set a plate in front of her, then sat across the table. "I don't know. Maybe that's why I was sleeping in my car, never staying anywhere long." Emma picked at her sandwich. "When I took your money, I told myself I needed it to keep running. But the truth is, I was tired of running. I just didn't know how to stop." And now, Emma met his eyes for the first time since entering the kitchen. "Now I think maybe I don't have to run anymore. These past 3 weeks working those jobs, sleeping in parking lots. It was hard, but it was honest. I forgot what that felt like." They ate quietly for a while. Tom found himself studying Emma's face, looking for the woman who'd shared his table 3 weeks ago. She was there underneath the exhaustion and worry. "What happens next?" Emma shrugged. "I don't know. I've got enough saved now to get a real apartment. Maybe find steady work. Start over properly this time." "Where?" "I was thinking maybe around here. If you think you could stand having me in the same county, I know I don't deserve it, but I'd like to try being the person you thought I was." Tom considered this. Having Emma nearby, knowing she was building a life instead of running from one, the idea should have worried him, but it didn't. "Mrs. Patterson at the county diner mentioned she needs help. Good tips. Decent people. Better than working 3 jobs." Emma's eyes widened. "You'd help me after everything?" Tom gathered their empty plates. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Emma. Even people who steal money from lonely farmers." "Especially them." Emma said softly. As afternoon stretched into evening, they talked about practical things. Emma's car needed work. She'd been driving it hard for 3 weeks. Tom knew an honest mechanic. She'd need references for apartments, jobs. Tom could help with that, too, within reason. When the sun started to set, Emma stood to leave. "I should go. I've got a room at the motel in town." Tom walked her to the car. As she opened the driver's door, he found himself struggling for words. "Emma." "Yeah. Thank you for coming back, for making it right." Emma nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for letting me." She paused, one foot in the car. "Tom, that night I left, I want you to know those 3 days here were the happiest I'd been in years. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I needed you to know." "I know," Tom said quietly. "They were good days. If you ever need anything, well, you know where to find me." She drove away as the last light faded, her tail lights disappearing around the bend. Tom stood watching until they were gone, then walked back inside.